Hey everyone, so my name is Amira Al-Gawabi. I'm going to be your MC. Woohoo! Very excited, very excited. So I am on rabble.ca's board of directors, and we've got Matthew Adams, the president of the board of directors of Rabble. We've got the publisher in the house, Kim Elliott. We've got Christina Turner and Victoria Fenner, who are staff at rabble.ca. So big round of applause for Rabble for putting this together. We are super thrilled to be putting this evening on with the Institute for Change Leaders to have a special evening with Amy Goodman. Before we jump in and dive into what's going to be a fantastic evening, we will, of course, do an Indigenous land acknowledgement for the being guests here on this land. I'm very happy to invite Don Miracle, who is a Mohawk from Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory and an Indigenous educator for more than 25 years to do our opening. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Sego Zewaguego, Dante Yungyat, Kungwehoega Yangahaga, Gadere Wawayansta. My name's Dawn Miracle from Tyendinaga, and I'm really honored and happy to be working with Olivia Chow and the Institute for Change Leaders, and happy to acknowledge everybody here today and the space that we're taking up, the space that we think, the space that we live, and the space that we work on, and ultimately the space that we come together in. So we'd like to acknowledge the sacred land on which we gather here today. It has been a site of human activity for thousands of years. This land has been a Haudenosaunee-speaking territory for centuries, as well as Huron-Wendat, Peyton, and Seneca, and most recently visited by the Mississaugas of New Credit. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement later made between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is the Six Nations in Iroquois, and the Ojibwe Confederacy of Allied Nations, or the Anishinaabe, to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful for the opportunity to work in this community and on this important territory. Now, I want to ask you, how many of you have heard the land acknowledgement before? Wonderful. How many of you have heard why? Okay, so I think that this is a place where we all need to work. It's important to talk about why, because we share this space. And if we don't understand the land which we all inhabit, how can we attempt to understand how to come together, how to meet each other in the middle, how to meet spirit to spirit, and how to do effective work if we don't acknowledge, respect, and ground ourselves in the places and spaces that we take care of? So I just want to ask all of you to take a moment to close your eyes and take a deep breath. And take 3 more. And every time you breathe out, imagine your feet and your toes going into the ground and feeling yourself grounded and connected to this land. Because no matter what work we do, no matter where we are, we're connected to that land. And it's easy in the hubbub and the busyness of life. It's easy when we're fighting battles in social justice to forget about that and to feel alone. But those roots that you allow your feet to extend to are part of who you are part of where you're connected, and it's a place that we can all meet. So I'd like to thank you. Nyawa.
Thank you so much, Dawn. All right, so here we go. We're super excited, of course, to have Amy Goodman with us today. We're also excited because we'll be making a special announcement about the first Jack Layton Journalism for Change Fellowship later in the program as well. So super lineup here. Before we keep going, I want to, of course, take a moment to thank our sponsors. So listed in the program that you all have, you'll see that CUPE, USW District 6, CUPE Ontario, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, Union Pride, Ryerson Infoscape Research Lab, JSource, and This Magazine. So thank you to those sponsors for all of your hard work to get us here tonight. Another special thanks to Sustaining Democracy sponsor, Uniform, and to our media sponsor, Now Magazine, and the Department of Social Justice Education at OISE. With gratitude and thanks, of course, to the volunteers who, without them, we could not make all of this possible. Now, for those of you who have your cell phones, absolutely use them. make sure your ringers are off. And if you are on Twitter, you can tweet #GoodmanTO for tonight. Now, it is my deep, deep pleasure to be introducing journalist and changemaker Desmond Cole to get us right to our keynote.
Thank you. I warmed him up for you, Amy. I was given a couple of minutes to speak here, but I know everybody is here to hear Amy Goodman, as am I. So the only thing I'm going to say before we get to the main event is that Amy and Democracy Now! Represents an example for me of independent journalism at its finest, of what independent news-making and change-making and movement building can mean, that we can do all of these things together. And inexplicably, I've spent a lot of time in the corporate media in this country fighting battles that feel so impossible sometimes. And maybe someday soon I'm gonna have to take after Amy's example and start doing my own thing, because we have to have spaces for these things. But we're here. Amy's been on television for over 20 years. We have Rabble that's been operating in this country for 17 years now. And I want to say, not only is it important for us to have independent media, it is also, there's no point in having an independent media if we're not going to hold it to the highest standard, which means that the garbage that we see and hear and read in corporate media is not the standard by which we judge the independent media work that we're doing, because that standard is not good enough for us. We have to create our own standard. As I'm sure many of you in this room know, Amy Goodman has been operating Democracy Now!, a daily independent award-winning program and broadcast on radio and satellite TV and across the world. Amy is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Gandhi Peace Award for, quote, a significant contribution to the promotion of enduring international peace. Amy was awarded with the '98 George Polk Award with Jeremy Scahill for investigative journalism on Chevron's role in Nigerian dictatorship, and the 1993 Robert F. Kennedy Prize for international reporting with Allan Nairn for coverage of the of the East Timor. Why does anyone ever read off a phone these days? This is my bad. Off of the East Timor independence movement and the Santa Cruz Massacre. Last year, Amy was criminally charged in connection with her coverage of the protests of the Dakota Access pipeline in Standing Rock, North Dakota. You got arrested for doing your job as a journalist? What's that like? Just to let everybody know, I'm going to be in court next month, and I might need a little bit of support for the charges that I've received also, but that's another day. Amy's charges, which were condemned by the Committee to Protect Journalists, were ultimately dismissed. And today's talk is going to recount her personal experiences as a journalist covering citizen grassroots-based movements, these whom daily confront and resist repressive governments and regimes in support of social, economic, and climate justice. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome my friend Amy Goodman to the stage tonight.
Can we move that? What? Oh, wait. Before Desmond sits down, Desmond, could you say the date that you're going to court and why you're going to court?
You wouldn't believe how much stuff fits behind this podium. On November 23rd, I will be saying more about this at a point in the future, but because I went to the Police Services Board meeting in July, and because I decided at that meeting to speak about an issue which was not on the agenda, which was the brutal beating by a police officer here in Toronto of DeFonte Miller, a black teenager in Whitby, because I chose to speak to that issue, which was not on the police board meeting, but which should have been, and because I refused to stop opening my mouth and saying words out of it when they didn't want me to, they cleared the Police Services Board meeting room, they brought in the police, and they arrested me for trespassing in the police headquarters at a public meeting. And I was told that I couldn't come back to the Police Services Board. If I came back again, I would be arrested again. But I did come back last month with about 150 people, and suddenly they were okay. So I'll be going to, I believe it's Old City Hall Court on November 23rd in the morning. Old City Hall, November 23rd. I'll be giving more information about this as I'm getting closer to it in the future, and I hope as many of you as possible will come and tell these people to get lost.
Well, it's such an honor to be with all of you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Desmond. I look forward to introducing you when you come to New York and speak. We've had Desmond on the show, and you can check it out at democracynow.org. This is our fourth stop in Canada this weekend. We started in Winnipeg on Friday night and then moved on to Halifax last night. Today we were in Guelph in the afternoon. Wrapping up here, celebrating Rabble and all that it is, and so excited to hear about this new Jack Layton Fellowship. And I look forward to hearing Olivia speaking after about the significance of this fellowship. It is so important that that we have generations of independent journalists. It is more critical now than ever. So I originally started in broadcast media on Democracy Now, before Democracy Now, on WBAI radio in New York. And I came out of a proud tradition, Pacifica Radio, which was founded in 1949 in Berkeley, California by a war resister named Lou Hill, who said when he came out of the detention camps after World War II, there's gotta be an independent media, a media that's brought to us by someone other than the weapons manufacturers who profit from war. George Gerbner, the former dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, founder of the cultural environment movement, would say, we need a media that is not brought to us by corporations that have so little to tell and so much to sell that are raising our children today. And so Pacifica was born. KPFA in Los Angeles, 49. KPFK in Berkeley, 49. KPFK in Los Angeles, 59. My station in New York, WBAI, 1960. Within a year of WBAI going on the air, they were broadcasting a debate between the great writer and activist James Baldwin and Malcolm X over the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, the lunch counter sit-ins. WPFW went on the air in 1977 in Washington, and KPFT went on the air in Houston in the Petro Metro in 1970. That is the only radio station in the country, KPFT in Houston, that was blown up. It went on the air in the spring of 1970, and within a few weeks, in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, it was blown up. The Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. Now, I thought Alice's Restaurant was a great song, but... So they takes a few weeks to get back on their feet, to rebuild the transmitter, they go on the air, and the Klan straps 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blows it up again. So now it takes months. Finally, January of 71, all the media is, covering this phoenix rising from the ashes. Arlo Guthrie comes to Houston to finish his song live on the air, and KPFT has been broadcasting ever since. Now, I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media can be. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it is a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it is an elder from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota or an uncle in Afghanistan, when you hear someone describing their own experience, it changes you. And it breaks down the stereotypes and the caricatures that fuel the hate group. I'm not saying you will agree with what you hear. I mean, how often do we even agree with our family members? But you begin to understand where someone is coming from. Makes it much less likely that you will want to destroy them. It's that understanding that's the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it is wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back. So, I come to you today in the midst of great turmoil in the United States. Our country has been slammed by these hurricanes. In Houston, the heart of the metro of the fossil fuel industry, submerged. And I think about those fence line communities. The term front line. This is fence line. Brian Paris taking the Democracy Now! Team, he's from Tejas and the Dirty Fuels campaign of the Sierra Club, to the communities that are hurt most. I remember the times that a front page story, rich and poor alike are affected by these hurricanes. Not exactly. Not affected equally. Yes, they're both hit, and we covered wealthy communities in Houston. They had their dinghies out, and they were, rowing to their houses. Absolutely, that was the case. But the question is how people recover, and there it's extremely different. And who gets hit hardest? Well, there is the hurricane, but there's what the hurricane unleashes. The fence line communities, like we went to the second largest oil refinery in North America, ExxonMobil in Baytown. It shut down because of the ferocity of the storm. The fence line communities are Latino communities. Many of the people are workers at the plants. They live on the fence line. Now, what happens in these situations is these oil refineries shut down. These are the most dangerous times, when they shut down and when they turn back on, because it is not clear what they are releasing. And using the opportunity, as your friend Naomi Klein talks about in the shock doctrine, using this moment to do things they've been wanting to do, like release toxins they're not allowed to do. Now, in the past, they would just be doing it on their own, but with the help of the Trump administration, what you see in Washington is an oligarchy, right? You have Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, who's the former head of the largest private oil corporation in the world, ExxonMobil. You have Scott Pruitt, former Attorney General of Oklahoma, sued the EPA 14 times, the Environmental Protection Agency. Comes out of Oklahoma, now the land of fracking. Hardly ever knew an earthquake. Now there are quakes all the time. He tried to shut down the EPA, and now he's the head of it and doing it in his own way as the head of it. And one of the things they did as this hurricane drowned Houston is say, okay, we will roll back all of these EPA protections using this moment. So companies are releasing toxins into the water. People are going through that water. Who knows what they are being exposed to? These are the fence-line communities. This is environmental racism. And when the money pours in, the millions of dollars voted by Congress, who gets it? Who will profit? And who will get even poorer? That really matters. You know, we just had Muhammad Yunus on this week, the former Nobel Peace Prize winner who established the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, once again reminding us of the Oxfam report earlier this year that said the 8 richest men in the world own more wealth than half the world's population, 3.5 billion people. And Muhammad Yunus said now it's 5 men, down from 8, before that down from 80. It is truly astounding. No, these hurricanes don't hit everyone alike, but they're hitting hard, and they're hitting more intensely, with greater ferocity and frequency. That is the definition of climate change. And we in the United States now have a president who is a proud climate change denier, calling it a Chinese hoax, proudly pulling the U.S. out of the UN climate accord that was reached in Paris in 2015. As hurricanes Irma and Harvey were crashing down on the Caribbean and the southern United States, President Trump went to Mandan, North Dakota, to stand in front of an oil refinery, to once again proudly gloat over pulling the U.S. out of the accord and talk about how he'd green-lighted the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access pipeline, standing not far from where hundreds of Native Americans were held in jail in Mandan for trying to create a more sustainable planet for taking on the Dakota Access pipeline. So you have these hurricanes hitting. Irma, Harvey, now Maria, drowning Puerto Rico. Who comes up with these names? I mean, I have friends Irma, Harvey, and Maria. I mean, as someone suggested, why aren't they called Hurricane Exxon, Hurricane Rex, Hurricane Chevron? Maria pounding Puerto Rico. The entire island is dark. You know what that means? No electricity, no clean water, no cell phones, means of communication, any kind of phone. This is incredibly destructive, and the fact of the matter it is now, whether we like it or not, a part of the United States. This is 3.5 million citizens that President Trump has, well, he went to Texas, he went to Florida, ensured that all sorts of aid got there, 2 states that voted for him. Puerto Rico, only because of enormous outcry, he is going on Tuesday as well to the U.S. Virgin Islands. So let's talk about what he has been doing. Right, last weekend, as Puerto Rico was drowning, no tweets on Puerto Rico. It's almost ridiculous to say tweets, that's how we tell you what the president is doing, but they have become the official presidential statements. No tweets on Puerto Rico, but about, I think it was roughly 15 against black athletes in the United States. 15 tweets against African-American athletes in the NFL and the NBA. It started on Friday night when he went to Huntsville, Alabama. When he feels threatened, he goes to his base. Alabama, 30 years ago, George Wallace, segregation forever, as he became governor of Alabama. And it's there that he makes this statement. President Trump says, "Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, 'Get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired, wouldn't you love it?'" Get that son of a bitch off the field. He's talking, for starters, about Colin Kaepernick, star quarterback of the 49ers, whose mother immediately tweeted, "Well, call me one proud." You know, I can't believe we have to beep the President of the United States. Not that we actually did, but okay, so this is what he said. He throws down the gauntlet, and people respond. He doesn't only take on the NFL, he takes on the NBA. Now, I'm not exactly a fan of organized sports, but I do have to say, I run home every day now to watch the latest football game. Okay, I turn it off after the Star Spangled Banner, but I've got to see this. So he takes on the NBA as well, right? National Basketball Association, rescinding an invitation to basketball champions, the Golden State Warriors, to visit the White House after the team's star player, Steph Curry, said he would not attend. Curry told reporters he and some of his teammates disagree with Trump and, quote, the things that he said and the things that he hasn't said in the right times. In response, Trump tweeted, going to the White House is considered a great honor for a championship team. Stephen Curry is hesitating, therefore invitation is withdrawn. This is Curry responding to Trump's attack. He says it's kind of surreal, to be honest. I mean, I don't know why he feels the need to target certain individuals rather than others. I have an idea why, he said, but it's kind of, well, it's just beneath a leader of a country. It's not what leaders do, Steph Curry said. Oh, and then the NBA superstar LeBron James weighed in. He's usually a fierce adversary, right, of Steph Curry. But he says, he tweets at Trump, you bum, Steph Curry already said he ain't going, so therefore ain't no invite. Going to White House was a great honor until you showed up. And what are they doing? Colin Kaepernick started it by sitting on the bench during the Star Spangled Banner. He wasn't even kneeling. First he was sitting. A guy in the military came up and said, why don't you do something more active? And that's when he took the knee. And of course, he's following in a proud tradition. He's following 1968, the Mexico Olympics. If some of you remember back and others you have read, you have Tommy Smith, John Carlos, who are part of a campaign for human rights, who go down to the Olympics to run, to race, but it's 10 days after the Tlatelolco Massacre, in which it's not clear how many hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed in Mexico City, students mainly. And they were very aware of this when they came down, not to mention what it meant to represent a country that was oppressing them, that was oppressing African Americans and people of color. And so when they won their race, well, first and third, Tommy first, John Carlos third, and they go up on the medal stand, they had a statement to make, and you all know it, the most famous picture of all. They actually just had one pair of gloves. Avery Brundage was the head of the Olympics, fierce Nazi sympathizing head of the Olympics for so long, and they didn't want to shake his hand, so Tommy Smith had brought his black gloves so that he wouldn't have to shake his hand. But they only had one pair of gloves, and they decided then they would share those gloves. So with one left hand and one right hand, they went up on the medal stand, and when the national anthem was played, they put up their fists in the Black Power salute, and they wore necklaces to symbolize lynching, to take their stand against lynching. They didn't wear their running shoes. They went without their shoes on, and they zipped up their jackets to be in solidarity with the working man. A lot of symbolism there. And that was the famous action that shocked the world and meant they found it very difficult to get another job when they came back to the United States. That's the tradition that Colin Kaepernick followed in. Let's not forget why he took the knee. I mean, we had Dante Stallworth on, a great football player, played for many teams, among them the team whose name we won't say because it's disparaging towards Native Americans. And Dante said, don't let the media change the narrative. Don't let President Trump change what it is that we are doing. Don't let him make us forget that he was taking a stand, Colin Kaepernick, by taking the knee against police brutality, against the killing of young black men. And let's remember why he did this. And you know something? Playing the national anthem and the team standing is actually quite new for football players. They basically used to be in the locker room until around 2009, and it was two Republican senators that exposed this, Senator McCain and Senator Flake, both of Arizona, in like a 150-page report called and talking about paid patriotism. The military realized what a ripe recruiting ground a football game is, and so they paid the NFL to ensure that the players would come out, and then they would bring out the flag and they would sing the national anthem, and that would bring on recruits into the military. That was like 2009. This is new. You know, the other day I was talking to a conservative German banker, and he said, I am so puzzled about what this hoopla is about. I don't understand the singing of the national anthem and the hanging of the flags. He said, you know, after World War II, we stopped doing this in Germany. It was frowned upon. These signs of nationalism are so dangerous, he said. And he was a conservative banker from Germany who happens to work in New York. It's really important to understand what these athletes have been protesting and what they say they will continue to protest. Going from football and basketball, and I just heard while I was here that the NBA has said they will require their players to stand during the national anthem. Not clear what this means. If President Trump is having his way. He said to a group of conservative politicians he had over for dinner the other day, hey, it's catching on, it's catching on. But he is tweeting all of this and attacking these African-American players. You know, the NFL is like more than 70% African-American, 27% white players. Trump, has managed to do something that hasn't happened in decades. Unite the players and the team owners so that they are all standing or locking arms or taking the knee. This has not happened before. What he wasn't tweeting about was Puerto Rico. Oh, well, he did it this weekend. He attacked the people of Puerto Rico, and particularly the mayor of San Juan. The mayor of San Juan, it won't surprise you to know that Carmen Yulín Cruz is a woman, the mayor of San Juan. We have mainly seen her in the last 10 days on television wearing a life preserver up to her chest in water, in this toxic, polluted, disgusting water, as she carries a bullhorn to personally try to tell people to get out of their homes, to save them, because there's no means of communication. That's where she has been spending her time, in the water in Puerto Rico, and President Trump goes after her before he heads down there. He says also that Puerto Ricans want everything to be done for them. Did he say that about Houstonians or the people of Florida? Puerto Ricans want everything to be done for them? So Lin-Manuel tweeted, Lin-Manuel Miranda of Hamilton fame, this great playwright, singer, actor, activist, remarkable. We're having his father on Democracy Now! Tomorrow, also an activist, Luis Miranda. What did Lin-Manuel tweet after President Trump attacked the San Juan mayor and attacked the people of Puerto Rico? Lin-Manuel tweeted, "You're going straight to hell, no waiting, no lines, they'll clear a path for you," he said to President Trump. I mean, it is just astounding. President Trump is redefining the White House. go back a few weeks to Charlottesville, to the horror of young white men, hundreds of them carrying torches through the University of Virginia, hundreds of them saying, Jews will not replace us, blood and soil, you will not replace us, white supremacists, Klansmen, proud, self-proclaimed fascists. Even the Tiki Torch Company issued a statement on their Facebook page, don't use our tiki torches, they said. Carrying these torches, terrifying people, and the next day, one of these white supremacists rams into the crowd and kills a beautiful young 31-year-old woman named Heather Heyer, an anti-racist, an anti-fascist who came out to say, we are better than this. This is not Charlottesville. What was on her Facebook page the day she died? If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. The next week at her memorial service, 1,000 people came out to the chapel, many of them wearing purple, her favorite color, with that T-shirt that said, if you are not outraged, you're not paying attention. And these young men marched, not with white hoods, because they didn't feel they had to anymore, cover their identity. They felt safe. This is what is so frightening this year. So with the attacks on trans people, President Trump issuing this edict over 3 tweets, it was the most astonishing thing. He starts by announcing we're going to have a new military policy. And then he waits 9 minutes for the next tweet. Even the Pentagon did not know what he was going to tweet. They thought possibly he was talking about bombing North Korea. So there was great tumult in the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're going to have a change of military policy. 9 minutes later, we're throwing all trans people out of the military. Inexplicably, he says this. This is right after the Secretary of Defense, General Mad Dog Mattis, that's what he calls himself, had said they're doing a study for 6 months and they will look at this issue. No, President Trump decides when he feels under siege, this is the kind of thing he does. And why does this matter? For so many reasons. What was it like for a trans soldier injured who's laying in a hospital bed to wake up and see this tweet of the president saying that he or she is going to be thrown out of the military when President Trump, got out of the military because he had bone spurs? What? But why it matters is the atmosphere that's created. I mean, do you know how many trans people have been murdered this year? And then look at what he did within his first week in office, right? He issues the Muslim ban. Straight out, unabashed, 7 majority Muslim nations, you will not be coming to the United States. But the response is what was so astounding. Well, I mean, the response since he has become president. I mean, he has his inauguration on January 20th. A respectable crowd comes out, 180,000 people. And then the media tweets the pictures of his versus President Obama's. President Obama had 1.8 million. He had 180,000. It was 10% the size of President Obama's, and size matters enormously to President Trump. And he just says his was the largest of any president ever in history. But even that obscured what happened just the next day, which was so significant because it's the same time, it's 24 hours later, the same place. 600,000 women, 3 times the size of President Trump's, come out to protest President Trump. 600,000 women in Washington, D.C. And that was not one of the larger protests. I mean, we went to Sundance Film Festival right afterwards to cover the documentary track in Park City, where like 10,000 women marched. I mean, they'd never seen anything like this in Park City. I mean, in Vermont, 20,000 people went to the state capitol. They'd never had such a large demonstration. They shut down the highways to stop people from going into the capitol because they just couldn't deal with the crowds. So at Sundance, I saw Kerry Washington, you know, scandal star. She was so excited because she had just given a speech at the march in Los Angeles. 750,000 women and their allies marched in Los Angeles. In New York, I mean, you take a stand on the football field by taking a knee. You march and you just have to stand there because you can't move anymore. In New York, there were so many women who were marching. Everyone just kind of stood there. They couldn't move forward. It is amazing, the response. And the response to the Muslim ban, just thousands of people raced to any airport they could. They didn't know if they'd be the only ones, or maybe they went with a friend, so they'd be with their friend. This was not organized. And this outpouring of what is the best of America. Of course, President Trump then attacked the judges who tried to stop him from imposing the ban. The first one, Washington State, he called a so-called judge. And then the second one was a federal judge in Hawaii. And it was Jeff Sessions, the former Alabama senator, who became the attorney general, whose major two issues are voting suppression and attacking immigrants. Immigrant issues are extremely important to him. Going after immigrants in the United States. But Jeff Sessions was on a right-wing radio talk show, the Attorney General, talking about the federal judge in Hawaii, and he said, how is it that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the President of the United States? I think the only one he gave hope to was the sovereignty movement in Hawaii that was saying, yeah, that's right, we shouldn't be a part of the United States. But people have not stopped. On Earth Day, thousands of scientists marched on Washington. It was one of the coldest April 22nds ever. We were freezing. It was pouring rain. And then 7 days later, we were there for the People's Climate March on the 29th. Hundreds of thousands came out for that. And it was the hottest April 29th in Washington, D.C. history, to give you an idea of how critical these issues are. So the response has been truly amazing. And so many of the people who came out to these marches, especially the People's Climate March, were Native Americans who came from all over converging on Washington, which brings me to the standoff at Standing Rock and how seminal, how important, how singular this year has been. April 1st, 2016, over a year and a half ago, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux in North Dakota, opened her property to the resistance, her property along the Cannonball River. The resistance to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access pipeline that Native Americans called the Black Snake. It would snake its way from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota, taking fracked oil from North Dakota through South Dakota, through Iowa, Illinois, hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Native Americans said no. Actually, they weren't the only ones. The people of Bismarck, North Dakota, said, no, we don't want it here, and their wishes were respected. The people of Mandan, North Dakota, said, nope, not here, respected. It's just that the Native Americans, their wishes were not respected, and they said no, and we're going to fight back, they said. And so they began to engage in civil disobedience. She opened her property, first scores of people came, then hundreds of people, then thousands. They have to open more and more resistance camps like the Red Warrior Camp and others. And people, it was the largest unification of indigenous people in the United States, from Latin America, the United States, the First Nations of Canada, that the US had seen in decades. The coverage almost nil, almost nothing. Now remember, this was the 2016 election year. So this is when the critical issues are being raised. In the general election debate, you know how the moderators on television, they call them journalists, I call them media personalities. Not one question was asked about climate change, about the fate of the planet, let alone the specific standoff at Standing Rock. And, you know, I go into these studios sometimes. I'm invited in to speak. And, you know, when you ask, why aren't you dealing with climate change? You know, people aren't interested is the general response. Really, people aren't interested. Well, we certainly know that in North Dakota, thousands of people deeply care. And among the issues the Standing Rock Sioux cared about was that the pipeline would go under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, and could possibly pollute the water of 17 million people downstream. They don't call themselves protesters, they call themselves water protectors. So we went to Standing Rock Labor Day weekend just over a year ago, like September 2nd and 3rd and 4th. We were reporting on it before, but from a distance. And then we went, and we were covering these remarkable protests. I mean, they start off in some of these protests, the back rural roads of North Dakota, with glasses of water on the road. And they perform water ceremonies, and the native elders, women, will hold the water. They walk forward with children, and they are met by a fully militarized sheriff's department. I mean, militarized. They have tanks, MRAPs, automatic weapons, drones, and they are meeting these peaceful water protectors. You know the image. I think you probably know it from Ferguson, right? That was August 2014, when a young African-American man named Michael Brown, just graduated high school, going on to community college, was gunned down by a white police officer named Darren Wilson. His body left to bake in the hot August sun for hour after hour after hour, and the people just rose up. It was a people's uprising. The corporate media actually came, and all of a sudden journalists were inhaling tear gas. And you saw the images on television of these fully militarized police departments of suburban St. Louis, Ferguson, and the other departments. It's just astounding the force they met the people of Ferguson with. I mean, this is recycling in America today. You take the weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan, and you give them to the police departments of the United States. Juan Gonzalez and I, co-host on Democracy Now!, had Norm Stamper in our studio a couple months ago. Norm is the former police chief of Seattle, Washington. He presided over the police attack on thousands of people in the Battle of Seattle in 1999. And both Juan and I were there. It was our first TV broadcast for Democracy Now! And I mean, thousands of people were protesting corporate globalization. You had high school kids, you had environmentalists, you had unionists, you had teachers, doctors, nurses, you had artists, you had farmers from around the world, all gathering in Seattle. And the force with which the Seattle Police Department took them on, I mean, they ran out of tear gas so fast they went to other states to get more gas. And it was Norm Stamper who presided over this. And when this was done, he was ousted, as he should have been. He now says it was the worst mistake of his life. He said, this is what happens when you look at your own community through the crosshairs. He said, do you know? He said, we forget there are children, our teachers, our librarians, our doctors, and our nurses. They are the enemy, like soldiers see people through their crosshairs. And so now he is a spokesperson around the country for police reform. So this is what the Standing Rock Sioux faced and all of their native and non-native allies as they marched through these rural back roads. And we covered this, and then on September 3rd, that was Saturday of this extended Labor Day weekend, they didn't think that Energy Transfer Partners, which owns the Dakota Access pipeline, they didn't think that they were going to be actually excavating that weekend. A judge was going to be ruling the following week It was the Standing Rock Sioux against the Justice Department. And right before that weekend, the Standing Rock Sioux said, you're going to be excavating our sacred burial grounds. And so the judge said, okay, prove it. You give me a map that proves their sacred burial grounds. And the Standing Rock Sioux complied and gave him a map, and he gave it to the other side, because judges do that. And when they came marching down the road, the Standing Rock Sioux, walking down the road to plant, and this is with many other tribes, First Nations, indigenous people, to plant tribal flags on that property, they saw the bulldozers operating at full tilt. And they were horrified. They were furious because they thought that the company had taken the map and had leapfrogged from where they were excavating forward to actually destroy their sacred burial grounds. And they felt they were doing this before the judge decided to change the facts on the ground. It would be a moot point. And they were furious. So they came up on the property, they see these bulldozers, and they move forward. First, women, little girls, boys, teenagers, older men, older women, and they're standing in front of these mammoth machines that are churning up the earth. I mean, I can't tell you how dangerous this is. We were filming. It was me, our producer, Laura Gottesdiener, our Democracy Now's Dennis Moynihan, who's here with me, who co-wrote the book, and John Hamilton, who was filming. And John just never turned this camera off. The bravery of these people, it reminded me at that moment, and I was scared. I thought back to March 16, 2003. That was 3 days before the US invasion of Iraq and another part of the Middle East in Gaza. A young American woman named Rachel Corrie, who went to Evergreen State College in Washington, had gone with the International Solidarity Movement, the ISM, to Gaza. And she had befriended a Palestinian pharmacist and his family. And Israeli military bulldozers were moving in to demolish his home. And these ISM activists put on these orange construction vests, you know, that construction workers wear, fluorescent, and they went in front of his house to stand in front of it. And she was standing in front of a bulldozer made by Caterpillar in the United States. And she was crushed to death. And that's what I thought about when I saw these women and girls standing in front of these bulldozers. But this time, the bulldozers pulled back. More and more people came from the resistance camps. They were walking forward, and the bulldozers were pulling back. They were moving back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, moving away from the crowds. And it was then that the Dakota Access pipeline guards unleashed dogs on the Native Americans. Attack dogs. And they were biting them. They were biting the horses. Some were riding horses. I mean, we were filming people who were bloodied, who were beaten, who were maced. We filmed a dog whose mouth and nose was dripping with blood. Even the dogs would pull back, and the guards would throw them into the crowd, and they'd bite their way out. But the people kept on moving forward, and they prevailed. Finally, the bulldozers, the guards, left in their pickup trucks and cars, and they moved on. I mean, the people had won, but at an unacceptably high price that day. Beaten, maced, bitten. How could this be? I mean, we interviewed Winona LaDuke of the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, who said, you know, Governor Dalrymple, the governor at the time of North Dakota, you are not George Wallace. This is not 1965 Alabama. We are through. So we have this video, and we posted it online that night, early the next morning. Remember how the network said people, you know, climate change, not interested. There were 14 million views in something like 24, 48 hours. I mean, any corporate network executive would drool over that number. 14 million views. So we go back to New York, continue to cover the story from there. President Obama was on this historic trip to Asia. First time a sitting president went to Laos. And at the end of his trip, in the middle of the next week, before the judge rules on Standing Rock, he holds a democracy forum to teach young Asians about democracy. And they came from all over southern Asia. And one of the last questions for President Obama, a young woman from Malaysia raised her hand and said, President Obama, can you talk about the Dakota Access pipeline? She dared to ask what no American journalist had publicly asked President Obama. He held forth eloquently about the oppression of Native Americans. He could have stopped it there, but he didn't. You know, leader of the free world, he can determine, how long his forum on teaching democracy to Asian students would last. But he did then say, as for DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, I have to go consult my team about that. And he did come home to Washington, and reportedly he did see the video of the dogs, and it wasn't lost on the first African-American president, the significance of dogs being unleashed on people. So on Thursday, Governor Dalrymple calls out the National Guard. Friday, the judge is going to rule. It doesn't look good for the tribe. And they quietly issued an arrest warrant for me. I didn't know it at the time. So on Friday, around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the judge rules. Terrible decision for the tribe. The tribe is crestfallen. And 15 minutes later, an unprecedented 3-agency letter from Interior, Army Corps of Engineers, and the Justice Department, where these lawyers are about to pop the corks for winning their big case. The Justice Department issues a statement that they're not going to allow the Dakota Access Pipeline to move forward for the moment. They want to check whether Native Americans were consulted with properly, whether there was environmental impact statement properly done, etc. I mean, the Native Americans were suffering from whiplash at this point. The worst decision, then we won? You know, it was very confusing. Now, that morning, Friday, before the judge's ruling, we did the show in New York, and then I raced to Canada. I wasn't fleeing. I was invited to the Toronto International Film Festival, right, last year, because they were showing a Canadian film about the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. And, you know, he told young journalists, if you can remember 2 words, remember governments lie. If you can remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. And that's what the film is called, and you should all see it, All Governments Lie. And they also profiled news organizations following in Stone's footsteps, like Democracy Now! So me and Nermeen Sheikh came up, co-host on Democracy Now! Oh, like Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone, so Matt came up. We spoke after the film. And I thought it was important to come up because it was just like 5 days after we'd experienced Standing Rock. And I know that people here care about First Nations, just the introduction. Everywhere we go, when you talk about the territory that you're on, is so deeply moving, and we don't see things like this in the United States. And so I thought it was important to come and just bear witness, so to tell that story. And the next day, Saturday, we were invited, our whole team, to the University of Toronto to speak. So I can't remember which room, it wasn't this one that we were speaking in, and we all, you know, spoke, and I talked about the standoff at Standing Rock, and in the middle of my talk, I looked down and I had gotten this text, and it said, "You're under arrest." So I don't know if anyone was here for that talk, but I was a little bit surprised. It said something like, "There's an arrest warrant for you." And I thought this is some kind of scam, and I looked around like, did someone just text this from the audience? Like, what is this? But then I saw it was, and no one texts me right now, it was a North Dakota number. So I thought, okay, so maybe I'm in trouble here. And okay, so I'm saying one thing, but I'm thinking another. I'm trying to think this through. If there's an arrest warrant, you're not necessarily picked up at that moment. It has to go into the system, and you're going to only be picked up if you have interaction with police or FBI or border guards. I have to go over the border to go home. And I think, okay, I have to get home before the arrest warrant goes into the system if this is all true. So I didn't say anything as I was speaking, but just at the end I just said, could someone call me a cab, please? And so I got to the airport and I did get home. So I came back to New York, and I didn't take the arrest warrant personally. I mean, I thought it was a warning to all journalists, do not come to North Dakota, which is exactly why we all had to go there. Now, I also thought it was critical to call the bluff of the authorities there, especially for young journalists, because when they don't have resources to back them up or institutions to back them up, I mean, how do you go and cover this historic moment, biggest unification of indigenous people in decades in the United States, if you think you're going to end up in jail? I mean, that's just not going to be easy for you. And I felt it was really important to let young journalists know you don't have to get a record when you put things on the record. And so we went back to North Dakota. A few weeks later, we're flying in. It was just about this time 1 year ago, maybe 2 weeks later. And we fly into Bismarck, and as we're flying in, we hear that the prosecutor has quashed the arrest warrant and dropped the charges. Good thing as we land. But he's going to bring more serious charges. He's charging me with riot. Riot, like I'm a one-woman riot? What is he talking about? Yeah. So I call my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before. And I said, I don't understand, what is this? What's going to happen? And so he said, I mean, it's not the most terrible thing in the world, he said. Don't worry. He said, you won't face more than a year in jail. I said, a year? I don't know about your life, sir, but like a year in jail? And I said, and when exactly will this all go down? He said, Monday at 1:30, you'll be arraigned. So this was Friday afternoon, which gave us 2.5 days to continue to cover the protests. But before we did that, I said to the lawyer, no, wait, there's nothing that happens between now and then. It's automatic. I go to he said, absolutely. I said, nothing. He said, well, the judge, he's going to rubber stamp it this weekend. But I said, judge? He said, no, it's a rubber stamping. Judges use their discretion during trials, but this is not that. Every single one will be rubber stamped. So I said, no, judge means discretion. I mean, the person can go from automatic, even if it's 100% of the time, to manual and make a decision in this case. Please tell me the name of the judge. So anyway, we put out a press release. We named the judge, and we said he would be deciding this weekend before the 1:30 arraignment whether, in fact, I would be arraigned, whether these charges would be brought. And we covered the protests over the weekend. There was a lot of press attention now. I mean, this was getting so big. But on Monday morning, the show must go on, and we were in North Dakota. So Dennis, who is here, hired a truck to come up from Minneapolis, a broadcast truck, because we had to decide where are we going to broadcast, across the street from the Mandan courthouse and jail, where so many hundreds of Native Americans had been imprisoned, exactly where I'd have to turn myself in, so right after the show I could go across the street. So we set up on church property across the street, and that was the backdrop, the courthouse, the jail, and the 10 Commandments in between. So we interviewed Chairman Dave Archambault, the 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux. Actually, he just lost the election a few days ago, but he was pivotal in this struggle. And I asked him if he'd ever been arrested. He said yes, at the beginning of the protests, and I asked what happened. And he said, well, he's charged with low-level misdemeanor civil disobedience. He said, I was strip searched, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. He's the 45th chairman of the, I mean, it's like President Trump is the 45th president of the United States. Chairman Archambault is the 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux. You were strip searched, you were put in an orange jumpsuit, and you were jailed. I interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, the pediatrician of the reservation. And I asked her if she was ever arrested. She said she was one of the first, because she cared about the health of the children. And I said, what happened? She said, oh, it was a low-level misdemeanor. And I said, so? And she said, well, I was strip searched, and I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. I mean, how much humiliation can a people take? So I was at the Bismarck airport at one of these times, and I was reading a magazine before getting on the plane, and a guy came up to me and said, don't think I don't know who you are. And I said, oh, well, can you tell me who you are? And he said, I was one of the guards on the site that day, Labor Day. I said, oh, did you unleash the attack dogs on the Native Americans? He said, no. He said, I was as surprised as anyone. You have to understand, he said, Energy Transfer Partners hired a bunch of security teams, and one of them was this kennel out of Ohio. And he said, no, we didn't know that was going to happen. He said, you don't think I get it? You don't think I get that we've massacred them for hundreds of years, and then we unleash attack dogs on them? I get why they're angry at us. You know, which just goes to show, never assume a person's position based on the position they happen to occupy. So we did the show, and more Native Americans came to show solidarity, perform ceremonies, and the time was ticking down to that 1:30. I mean, all the media is now covering this. New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Al Jazeera. It was on the BBC homepage. Vogue magazine was covering this. And right before 1:30, I get a call from North Dakota Public Radio, and a longtime host for decades who knows all the players, right? It's not a very populous state. And he says, the judge is not going to sign off on these charges. You're not going to be arraigned today. But it wasn't only me. Native Americans that were facing felonies and misdemeanors that day, a number of them had their charges dropped. This is what happens when the media shines its light in the right direction. This is so important. This is the kind of reality TV that we all must demand. You know, not the kind the 45th President of the United States starred in, but the kind that reflects the reality of people's lives on the ground. It is riveting, it is important, it is life-changing. They are all using our airwaves. They are not people's private property. They are a public treasure, and they have a responsibility to tell the truth. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day: war and peace, life and death. Anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of our countries. They can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to be killed or kill. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. And I just want to end by going back to World War II. You know, this is the end of the Jewish High Holy Days. Yesterday was the holiest day of the year. It was Yom Kippur. And I wanted to go back to World War II, to two remarkable women. One was Anne Frank, beautiful young teenage girl who was a victim of the Nazis, who wrote this amazing diary from the age of 13 to 15. Do you know that her father, Otto Frank, applied repeatedly for visas for the family to come to the United States? This is an experience Muslims know well. And he was denied, just like the voyage of the damned, the voyage of a ship that carried hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Jews was denied disembarking in the United States, basically because of anti-Semitism in the United States during World War II. And then there was another young woman named Sophie Scholl. Sophie Scholl was an undergrad at the University of Munich, and she and her brother, who was a medical student, Hans and Sophie Scholl, were not Jewish, they were Christian. And they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? And they decided with their professor, Karl Huber, and other students and workers, they'd form the White Rose Collective, and they'd try to get pamphlets out to let Germans know what was going on, so they'd never be able to say they didn't know. They issued a series of 6 pamphlets. On the 4th pamphlet, it said, "We will not be silent." They would mail these. They would drop them under cover of darkness in marketplaces, alleyways, schoolyards. And then Hans and Sophie and their professor were caught. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy now.